Hello beautiful starlets. So this is one of this week's videos as we want to talk about the goddess Badb and something that has been occurring in my life and other people's life, and there have been quite a few hints that this is a topic to be discussed this month, is Badb and nightmares. So the first thing that kind of gave this away is I was reading through my Facebook page, and somebody had asked, what is one thing that you wish someone had told you ahead of time that happens to you when working with the Morrigan? And one of the responses was, she gives you nightmares. My own nightmares had been fairly vivid and fairly frequent for a number of years, and it's not really something that I had necessarily attributed to working with the Morrigan, particularly in her phantom aspect of Badb. And I personally had wondered if it was a result of trauma, or perhaps it was spiritual confrontation. And so for me personally, my dreams, my nightmares are always very vivid. I can remember 3, 4, 5 a night, depending on the night. They're just very vivid. Sometimes you could make whole stories like around them. They could be movies in some cases. They are fully vivid, fully weird, and some of the nightmares are just horrifying. And I'm actually going to tell you guys about a nightmare that I had last night. And I was asking somebody that I had loved and trusted if they could scan my energy because I felt like there was something going on in my aura. And they took a pair of rusty keys and they ripped the back of my head open, and it was so horrifying that I like, when Daisy actually woke me up out of it, she pulled me out of it, which is really interesting, which kind of made me feel like there was an extra element to it, and I couldn't calm down. And in a very half asleep state, I went around and I drew sigils all over my arms, all over the back of my neck, all over my head, and I was very like kind of out of it, but still like protecting myself, and it was very disconcerting, very upsetting, it was, you know, unpleasant and violent, and it had that feeling of, is somebody trying to spiritually harm me? And I was questioning what it actually means to have nightmares. I was thinking about, like, are they prophecy? Within the realm of Badb, that would make sense, as she has examples within the mythology where she in particular has moments of prophesizing, particularly death elements, and we'll get into that in a minute. Are they prophetic in terms of being forward or backward facing? And it had that kind of crow vision element to nightmares, because the crow eyes are in the mythology, in the folklore, said to see forwards and backwards throughout time. So they basically exist within a linear space where time is not, as we perceive it to be, most of us, linear and straightforward. And with the hooded crow in particular being very sacred to Badb, and the consuming of souls taken across to the realm of the other world being part of the death element of the goddess Morrigan, that made me feel, and it gave me this idea which I can't get out of my head, which was that nightmares might be echoes from soul travel. And if one of those images is of, we have traveled in the shapeshifted form of crows through the Morrigan to the underworld, and the usual way that souls get there is to die and to be ingested into the crows, who then carry the souls to the Morrigan, and they are both her and psychopomps that ferry the dead across to the other world. Then perhaps nightmares were reflections of either memories of that, or like the trauma of that being deep rooted in the soul somewhere, that journey bringing up echoes of previous deaths or previous futures or parallel futures, or basically touching the live wire of the divine in moments where the subconscious takes over in terms of what's happening in our mind. Because when we sleep, the active mind is more silent, not completely, and we are processing what we've been through or what we have learned in any given day. But that doesn't make it huge amounts of sense in terms of the massive weird imagery that our brains can throw up. And so I was thinking about this in terms of, are nightmares revealing others' actions, or are they a horrible amalgamation of our own fear? Whatever the case might be, perhaps both, they are definitely an act of revealing what is concealed. And that to me is something that is very Badb-like, in the energy of things being concealed from us until the moment that they arrive. And that is almost the epitome of our own death, which the Morrigan guards in the mythology. Like she says to Cuchulainn, she guards his death. And to the divine, it is said, and to Morrigan, to the Badb in particular, they know the moment of death. They know when that occurs, but that is sheltered from us, concealed from us until the moment that it happens, because otherwise how could we live if we constantly, and that is something that has been explored in sci-fi so frequently, the idea that if you knew when you were going to die, would you want to, or would it ruin the entirety of the rest of the experience? And I've talked about in other places that forgetting is our superpower, which is a quote from a Doctor Who of all things, but that actually the power of forgetting is really, really powerful, and actually it works both for us and against us in many ways, because we over time begin to forget the pain of certain situations. And the Doctor Who quote goes, that's why you keep having wars and babies, because if you remembered in all detail, you probably wouldn't anymore. But that was really interesting, because that was, you are birthing things into being, and because you have forgotten the pain of childbirth and are left just with the love in most cases, hopefully, fingers crossed. And also that wars, that you forget the horrors of war, and that being death. And those are two realms of that death and rebirth energy, which we've covered quite a lot recently, talking about Morrigan energies. And so that the human ability to forget pain comes into this sort of crossover point, where nightmares might actually be the liminal servitors between the energies of life and death. That the nightmares are showing us our shadows, showing us our fears, and as such we are processing things which perhaps otherwise we might have forgotten, and perhaps we are carrying those moments of death, as Badb has said, within us, and those unprocessed memories of death from perhaps previous lives, quote unquote, I believe in parallel lives, but still, are causing us a lot of pain, a lot of unhealed energy that we are carrying within our soul body, and as such connect us to the underworld at all given points. Perhaps nightmares are all of these things, and they are phantoms in the way that they serve both the goddess, Badb, and the way that they actually serve our souls and help us through, depending on the different ways in which we can process nightmares, as well as dreams. And I think there is no separation between the two. They're basically just different echoes, and we put our own value judgment on whether it's a dream or a nightmare, whether it brings out certain emotions in us and we give it a certain title. But maybe it's just all parts of the self expressing all parts of the self in connection with divinity, and how we are afraid. Fear is perhaps at the root of a lot of our personal shadows, a lot of the things which are really difficult for us to process. And so that idea that nightmares come because, and it's a very psychological analysis instead of a spiritual one, that nightmares come about as a result of trauma or unresolved issue, unresolved shadow, and they bubble forth in dreams when the subconscious is in the driver's seat, so that we are actually playing out our fears to overcome them in a slightly safer environment, and perhaps the surroundings change because that makes it less real less terrifying. And then the idea, again, is heavily enriched in horror and sci-fi. The idea that you can't escape in your dreams. You are forced to confront some of the worst things that are truly terrifying, and it's not even abstract in any way, and that fear can actually, you know, kill people. And people have explored that idea in literature for hundreds of thousands of years. The human interest and even obsession with things that are frightening, with horror, with the grotesque, with the macabre, and with death, are all really interesting to me as symptoms of over-sanitized society, a society which over-sanitizes the energies of death, puts them out of the way, puts them in a nice little box that someone else has to deal with. We don't really face and confront death anymore, and so we don't see it in the same way, or we're unlikely to see it in the same way. It's not like the ancient Celts who were dealing with the bloody on the battlefield all the time. We think of death, again, as very separate from ourselves, and nightmares seem to me to be the connection point between how we have over-sanitized our lives, and then there are these moments of allowing the animalistic human nature out. I'm not somebody who encourages violence. I don't, full stop. But I think there is a underlying animalistic primal part of the human animal, because we are animals, that has the capacity for great violence. And when working through things with Badb, we become acutely aware of the moments where we could have devolved into a kind of violence, and I can think of just one major occasion for me personally. That's when I was confronting my father about abusing my sister, and I knew in that second that if he had taken one more step forward, I would have lost myself. I would have been very violent, and I think I radiated that because a man who was 6 foot backed off me, who is 5'3", and I was just radiating pure hatred, anger, and violence in that moment. And it's not a moment that I wish to feel again at all. And it was horror, pure horror in that moment about all the things that had been happening and what had happened in that moment. And in that was like a nightmare, but real. And so when people who are working through traumatic events with goddesses such as Badb are looking at shadows, are looking at nightmares, then it can be all too real because they have already experienced this in the waking world, if you like, if you see those things as being separate, which is, again, debatable. I don't tend to see things as being completely separate. Like, are we always dreaming? I think is a really fascinating idea, that when we're thinking, when we're creating, when our brain is making up stories, making up lyrics, making up poetry, or just analyzing through a conversation that we had, or just imagining something into being, that actually that is the same as dreaming. It's just that we are more active brained when we're awake, and then when we sleep, that process just continues, but it becomes more vivid and we pay more attention to it. So in that case, nightmares could be the natural result of our mind's ability to create great beauty and great horror, and sometimes they're all intermeshed into one weird amalgamation, like I said. Therefore, within these ideas, it feels to me like soul travel within nightmares. It is as if we go to the nightmare realm within the underworld, as if we pierce the veil, and that we confront the things that we are afraid of. We confront the things that are the shadows within ourselves. We confront what we're most afraid of. And I think for a lot of us, whether we fully realize it or not, the thing that we're most afraid of is ourselves in some capacity, because all we have in the end right now is ourselves. Now we can rely on other people, we can make connections, but when you get right down to it, the person who you have for life, no matter what, is yourself and your connection with the gods. And that changing evolutionary state of being affects us in many different ways. And so we can actually be terrified of who we are, who we're becoming, who we've been, and our capacity for all sorts of things, which is why we do shadow work. Are we afraid of the repressed animalistic side of ourselves? Are we afraid of our capacity for anger, for rage, for violence, or our capacity to fall into the opposite way, which is almost like that stupor, that fear element that kind of chains us up and stops us from becoming who we want to be? Do we feel distracted from the true path of our life, and we're afraid we are wasting time or wasting life force because we're not truly being who we want to be for a number of reasons? It is basically that nightmares confront the act of repression that a lot of us go through, and what we're repressing is always us, but what we are repressing is different. So I might be repressing trauma, and then trauma triggers all these nightmares because they cannot be shunted down in a box forever and ignored. It's not how the human experience works, especially when you're in a spiritual path. You travel, you soul travel all the time. You want to go through deep meditational places in the underworld. You want to connect with deities, and in my case, such as Badb, and that sometimes means confronting yourself on the road to yourself. It's like it's very Inanna. My friend had just done an Inanna meditation, and it reminded me of some of the ideas of Inanna, of all the pieces of yourself that you're tearing away, and then Arash Nagal is kind of putting all the pieces back together, and that grotesque imagery had already come up with the Badb poetry, and on the image that I fell over for the Badb poem, and that idea of cutting yourself open and reattaching and stitching had been present with me for a very long time, and I'm gonna actually just read a little bit of some of the earliest Badb imagery, which is starting to take on new meaning for me, from one of her channel poems. And this is, like I said, this is one of the very early ones. This is actually in the original Songs of Shades, which is when Badb came. And when Badb came for me, I knew it was not yet my time, but I had screamed for death, and she had heard me, and with an otherworldly scythe cleaved me in two, and demanded I remember who I was. Sew it up, she told me, and with every inch of that pain scream your utmost. Badb had given me a voice, and I remembered how much I was alive, even when it tore me to pieces. And this connection with Badb, who is my matron, who is the aspect of Morrigan who I work with the most, constantly speaks to me in these sorts of poetic forms that sometimes reveal themselves to be multi-layered in riddles for years and years afterwards, which is something I freaking love, to be honest. I freaking adore it. It's something that gives me life. It breathes new life into old words, which is something about that which just tickles my soul. And I just wanted to touch on a few points here with regards to nightmares. So, and when Badb came for me, appeared to me, arrived, showed herself, and I feel like the goddesses in general, gods and goddesses, do often show themselves in dreams. And for me, I had been saying, well, I don't dream about Morrigan. That's like something that almost never happens to me. And she just poked me in the ear, because my hearing just went all funny, like, oh, now you're listening. But she's not been coming to me in dreams. I have been separating the idea of dreams and nightmares until she's been coming in nightmares. There are echoes of Badb in the nightmares, and echoes of the lessons of Badb in the nightmares. And it just kind of blew my mind to realize it. So I had screamed for death, and she had heard me. And I think that is multi-layered in itself, because screamed for death is, on the surface of it, when you're so much in pain that you're screaming out to end it, is the initial feeling there. But it's also something else. So I've actually talked about the death scream in last month, and I've talked about the fact that the death scream can be silent. It doesn't have to be vocally loud. It can be this hissing, and the most painful version, I would say, of the death scream is when you are so hoarse in grieving or grief or pain or anger or anguish that you're like screaming, but nothing's coming out because you have nothing left to give. And that is very silent, and that's like the whole body gets involved. It's almost like retching, but as if you're going to be sick, but you're not. It's about breath. But there is something in there about the screaming and crossover between that and the nightmare, because I scream in my sleep. That's one of the ways in which I spiritually protect myself. That's how I came to know the death scream. So the death scream is also screaming from a place of dreaming nightmares where you're connected to the underworld with death. And I'm like, this is blowing my mind as I'm talking about it. It's just like all the pieces stitching in together. More about stitching in a minute. Otherworldly scythe cleaved me in two, and I often see Badb with a scythe, or tooth scythes, to be honest. And that's just one of the ways in which I see her. Cleaved me in two and demanded I remember who I was. Sew it up, she told me. And then the imagery that I found came across for this month had all this body like stitched back together. And I think that is a very visceral, morbid way of representing shadow work, representing spirit work, when we're tearing pieces of ourselves off, trying to decide, quote unquote, decide what is valuable, what is worthy, what is worth our attention, when really all of it is worth our attention, and we end up stitching ourselves back together. We might be trying to drain some of the poison out which has been put there by ourselves or by others, by experiences, and in so doing we might need to like tear open a metaphorical vein and allow the poison out. But when we actually are tearing ourselves open and throwing away parts of ourselves, we're actually doing ourselves a disservice, which is where the sew it up comes from. Like, and that is painful. The reconstitution of the emotional body, of the spiritual body, after we have done ourselves disservice and torn ourselves apart, is really, really painful. And with every inch of that pain, like stitching yourself back together, scream your utmost, which is kind of the duality of the screaming out and the screaming in. And Badb had given me a voice, and I remembered how much I was alive even when it tore me to pieces, and that is the memento vivere coming through again. So that life is tearing me to pieces, I am tearing myself to pieces, and it's up to me to stitch myself back together again. And I feel like nightmares are some of the ways in which we tear ourselves apart. We are playing out in our own mind our worst fear, our worst moments. Or we are maybe putting an amalgamation of our fears and our worst moments, so things become very abstract, maybe less traumatic depending on what is happening. But I definitely feel like it's all taking place in the underworld, and we're traveling down and seeing it play out, and it's very real. That's what I'm getting at. Just because it's all like up here in the head, just because we see it at night when we're asleep, doesn't make it any less real for us. And I definitely had very real reactions to my recent traumatic nightmares. And so all of these things come into play, that the macabre elements, the animalistic elements, the human elements of self that we have repressed down and tried to get rid of, because Badb and the Morrigan in general reminds us of our most sacred selves in all circumstances, that the human condition is not separate from the visceral violence of the world, and there is that happens too. And it is not to encourage violence. It's not that violence is a better state of being than seeking out peace. It's just that the nature of human beings is an amalgamation of both, and we have put things in the sort of warlike camp and the peace-like camp, and we have created these divides, because human beings are capable of truly horrifying things, and then so that we have almost removed that to the on-screen horror in the hope of like safely observing these elements of human behavior. And it makes me think of like how a lot of us are fascinated with like the serial killers and the documentaries and things that come up with regards to that, because it's almost like safely learning about the worst kinds of human behavior, reaffirming our morality and our ethics within our own self at the same time by witnessing it removed. So we're witnessing through our eyes, through one lens, through one screen, usually on another screen, right, of some description. And dreaming and nightmares are almost the same thing, because we feel removed. We don't feel like it's real. Our mind conjures up stuff which makes it even less real. So, you know, the person becomes a dragon or whatever, and it kind of has deep-rooted symbolism on the one hand, but it also removes the realistic. And it's almost like all of these are slightly safer ways to observe the human condition in so doing. But if we are dreaming at all times and dreaming things into being, what does that mean for our nightmares? Which is a terrifying thought, right? If we are in the process of manifestation at all given points, then what does that mean for our nightmares too? That we can quite easily manifest our shadows, bringing our fears to blossom. And one of the things that I had already connected with Badb is the odd journey to the underworld with foxes and hares, or foxes and rabbits, and it was about rabbit being the fear caller. And there was an interconnection between the energy of fox and rabbit. Now, I obviously have fox energy, so it took on a whole different meaning for me as well. But that kind of bringing forth your fear so you can confront it on the battlefield of your shadow and your soul is incredibly Badb-like. This is the thing that terrifies you the most. Conquer it. That is the Morrigan in a nutshell, and she's done that to me in the waking world. Time and time again. So that would then reflect and parallel in the world of nightmare is no surprise to me in the realm of dreaming. But it does mean that we should be careful what we manifest. Now, I'm not the person who's like, oh, you're to blame for your life because you manifested it. Fuck that. That's spiritual bypassing, and just no. But I do think we have to be careful not to completely repress the parts of ourselves, to do this disservice to this part of ourselves. So the only way that Badb in my case can drag it up is through in nightmares. But also I do want to touch on the fact that I do feel that when we go into the place of the underworld, we crisscross the point of the spiritual ecosystem. It's very crossroads, very of the underworld, and crisscrossing at the roots of the spiritual ecosystem. And that we touch on different lives, and we touch on different people's energies. So is it possible that a goddess who is prophetic brings us prophetic nightmares? Absolutely. Absolutely. We could be picking up on energies through the spiritual ecosystem that we don't fully understand in the waking world, and then we dream them by night. We give them form, we give them idea, we give them shape when our subconscious mind takes over. And if these things are horrible and we don't like them and they hurt us and they harm us or they frighten us, then they become more nightmare in their shape. So yes, I feel like they could be prophetic, whether backwards or forwards looking, and by which I mean this has already happened but you don't know about it because it's outside of your sphere of control or vision, or it has yet to occur and it will, because time isn't as linear and straightforward as I've said many times. But also Badb with her crow eyes, hooded crow eyes, time is all relative anyway. And so that is how I personally feel about the journey of Badb and nightmares. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Many blessings, and I'll catch you next time.